Now you can see you have fascinating exchanges between the panelists. The floor is yours now. Please stand up, go to the microphone, identify yourself, and ask a quick, short, sharp, brilliant question.
Quick, not brilliant. Winston Mock, I'm the owner of a digital media school. The question...
Owner of what, sorry?
A digital media school.
Ah.
The question is rising Asia causing increasing global inequality? That is, as Asia exports its goods and services, are we exporting poverty and inequality to the rest of the world?
Yeah.
Right. Now, I mean, that doesn't apply just jokingly to the Western world, US and Europe. I was in Egypt earlier this year.
Egypt?
Yeah, around the time of the revolution. I left on January 25th, the day of the revolution.
You started it.
Almost. That's another time. Now, even among traditional leather craftsmen in Egypt, they have been wiped out by imports from China. So if you're European tourists visiting Egypt, traditionally you were buying handmade, leather-made goods in Egypt. Now it's all imports from China, as an example. So is that a fair statement of Asia causing inequality worldwide? And if so, how can that be mitigated other than just redistribution through taxation?
Yeah. I think, Judith, you touched upon that in your remarks, I believe, and then we'll ask Fu Jun whether he's the cause of the Arab Spring.
I'll let him answer.
Yeah. We can blame.
Okay, what do you think?
Well, Judy,
You're on your own now.
to me, it's a matter of empirical observation, tentative observation. If I look at the macro picture, I do see using aggregate data, I do see a case of convergence in terms of wealth distribution globally. The reason in the way is simple because under globalization, we tend to learn from each other. If you do this, I do this. You see convergent performance. But the micro picture is different because of different configurations of factors of production. When you see Asians rising, when you see China's rising, and you open up the picture at the micro level, it's a totally different case. And the trend, it seems to me, I have concerns, the trend is moving towards the opposite direction for the reason that I have mentioned. I also want to add the problematic aspects of capital. There I'm looking at 3 dimensions of capital: physical capital, human capital, social capital. To get rich, the basic element is you need to have access to capital. But that is not enough. If you just have that, you do not have human capital, you're not going to sustain that growth. You need to be healthy, and you also need to be well educated as human capital. In the process of concentration of manufacturing facilities in China, we probably have neglected the human dimension of the capital. You use labor very instrumentally. You just use labor without invest enough in terms of human capital. And also, the other dimension is also important, the social capital. Why the capitalists were able to get the most mileage out of this game? Because they are very rich in terms of social capital. They can come together and sit and talk and cut a deal. If you use labor just instrumentalistically, and even worse, if you use policies to restrict the movements of labor. For instance, you will see peasants moving from countryside to cities. You see, oh, labor is moving. But not really, because when they move, they do not have the social political entitlements to go with them. So that systematically also depress the incomes on the part of the labor. So when you add all these together, the physical capital, the human capital, and the social capital, and it seems to me there is a systemic mechanisms against labor getting a fair share of what they should have.
But I think his point was that because of China's success in all its exports, manufacturing exports, is actually now can produce Egyptian artifacts cheaper than the poor Egyptians can.
Can I speak up for China?
Then,
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
I mean, you know, I had a very similar, quite funny experience where I was in Palestine, in the West Bank, and I was in a market in Hebron, and they were trying to sell me, as they always do, a headscarf, which is a symbol of Palestinian nationalism. And as part of the sales pitch, they said, this one was actually made in Palestine. And I said, you know, aren't they all? They said, no, all the others are made in China. But nonetheless, I mean, I think that although it does, you know, have an impact on manufacturing jobs, clearly China's super competitive, it also brings all sorts of benefits, well, you know, cheap manufacturing from China, because it brings, you know, look at those mobile phone statistics. How can it be that 70% of people in Kenya or whatever it is have a mobile phone? Well, it's because they're very cheap. Why are they very cheap? Because they're produced very competitively in China. You know, why are people visibly better dressed in places like...
But then if you look at the micro figure for a iPhone worth $600 US, China only get roughly $6. For a mobile, $6. Yeah. And for a mobile iPhone that is worth $300, roughly.
But that's right at the top
So
end, and most people don't have iPhones. But you know, lots of the cheap mobile phones. I mean, I'm making a point that China's benefited the world because
He's saying something nice about China.
whether it's clothes or mobile phones or all sorts of cheap goods, which actually is a form of improving the lives of the poor all over the world by reducing the price of goods.
Yeah.
That's, you know.
Okay.
But the point I want to make, Kishore, is I do sort of see trends where globally the capitalists are conspiring together at the cost of labor. So Marx is coming
communism
back.
is alive.
So Marx is coming back. We were discussing at lunch today that Marx is coming back again. Okay, Astrid, and then we come to you. Wait, Astrid, please. Yeah.
Astrid Tuminas from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. One of the most persistent and arguably most pernicious forms of inequality in rising Asia is what the literature calls the gender gap, i.e., despite gains in tertiary education and health, women continue to be severely underrepresented in positions of authority and decision-making and power in so many countries in Asia. I would argue that Asia can't keep rising without harnessing fully the contributions of its most skillful and ambitious women. So I'd like to direct this question to the panelists coming from Indonesia, China, Malaysia, and Vietnam. Can you tell me the single best thing going on now in your countries to bridge the gender gap? Thank you.
Okay, Karim.
Okay, I've got to answer this. I was with...
Watch out. When Karim gets going, you know.
No. It's just so bizarre you asked this, because I was with Lim Guan Eng, the Chief Minister of Penang, and he was telling me, you know, Karim, Malaysia is facing a fundamental challenge now, and it's really major. And I said, what? He said, university enrollment now is 70% women, 30% guys. And he said, and it's coming into all the civil service now. The women are so much better, he says. And in his state, the two mayors that he has, they're both women. And so he's an enormous supporter. And virtually all the ministers I've talked to, they all feel that their women officers are better. And so there's definitely going to be a big push towards women officers in civil service because of the lines coming out.
And your next prime minister is going to be women, too.
Who's it?
Your next prime minister will be a woman?
Who knows? Who knows? I think that's a very delicate thing to discuss. Yeah. I didn't say anything. But I think what we're seeing then is we are a majority Muslim country, however. How will Malay Muslim men cope with the fact that the women are going to be doing so much better? And you find this across the board in private sector as well. Most of the corporates prefer to employ women as well. Mm-hmm. So this is strange, you know. Everyone talks about the gender gap, but in Malaysia, we're seeing it reversed.
Oh, come on,
Okay.
comment on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Well, in Vietnam, we don't yet compete with you. I mean, we are more or less on balance with a little
Better.
more than, 50% of females at higher education level. But that's not the point. That's just the beginning of the race. Women, at that point, they are on top. And then they start losing out. When it comes to moving into labor and career promotion, they lose out. And they keep being number 2. So the big challenge is Vietnam, when will there be more number ones? Because, you know, it's very paternalistic. women are always in number 2 positions. So that's the big question in Vietnam. But the hope that I see is that thanks to the economic reform and the new law on enterprise, now 1/3, a full 1/3 of small and medium enterprises are headed or owned by women. And some of them then move to the political track, becoming, congresspersons, or one of them just being appointed to being deputy minister of our own MITI, I think they should go the economic power empowerment route and then shift to the political, empowerment route. But
Right.
I tell you, the battle starts only after higher education.
I think if you're already in the university in the majority, that's already quite an
It is,
achievement.
actually.
Yeah.
I do not have a firm answer, but I do want to toss out a sort of provocative hypothesis. Probably it's continue to be the negative impact of the long shadow of Confucianism.
Long shadow of Confucianism.
If you take Confucianism seriously, right? You look at many of the countries, they continue to be somewhat influenced by historically Confucianism. But the tenets of Confucianism, or the core, the tenets of Confucianism is let emperors be emperors, ministers be ministers, fathers be fathers, men be men, women be women. That's all hierarchical. So it's fixed there. All else being equal. I guess that probably worked well in agricultural society, but now it's post-industrialized society, at least in parts of the world. But in Asia, it's still industrialization. But as you go through exhaustive process of industrialization, the job we have tend to be less physical, more intellectual. And that works against the Confucius tenets of that hierarchical system. But we continue to live under that shadow. But it's for you to test whether or not that hypothesis has some validity there.
Yeah. Anis?
Yeah, well, I would also highlight what Karim has said earlier. In our university, maybe we need an affirmative action for the boys, because the ladies were doing well in terms of
More than
academic-
50%?
Yes, in terms of numbers, they're increasing. And in terms of scores, always whenever we have best graduates, most likely these are women. So that's a trend. But let me give a bigger picture. Indonesia being seen often from the outside as a Muslim majority nation, one of the biggest Muslim country in the world. However, this is also a country similar to Malaysia in which the role of women, it's much easier to distinguish which belong to religion and which roles belong to local culture. And the culture has already provided that sense of equality, for instance. I think culturally it's there. And I think we're started to see the effect of that in today's world. So in education, we're seeing a more balance. Now, rules on parliamentary members, for instance. Now, they adopted some, I forgot the exact percentage. It's mandatory to have a women candidate for the parliaments. However, it's not always easy to find women who are willing to run. And that's sort of a challenge. But I would put a note. Across Muslim majority nations, Indonesia is the first, one of the very first country that have educated women long before many other countries. And actually the first PhD, women PhD, is from Indonesia. And Al-Azhar University opened program for women in 1957, only after the leadership of that university came to visit women's school in West Sumatra in Indonesia. Since then open up education for women. So Indonesia has also served in that sense as a model that helped other nations to adopt a more woman-friendly approach in that sense.
I'm very respectful of all of these comments, and I'm not a deep expert or resident in any of these countries, but I can't help but muse, given the work we do with poor and vulnerable people around the world, how increasingly disadvantaged girls are relative to boys even today in many of these countries, in primary and secondary education, even in countries that have mandatory education. If there's a poor harvest, if there's a health problem, it's the girl who's pulled out of school, not the boy. So I do think in many countries where property rights are still an issue, women and girls do not have property rights where men do, particularly in the more agricultural societies. So there is a wonderful opportunity for those who make it through those traps in higher education in many of these countries, which I think is terrific. But we shouldn't fool ourselves that the problem that girls have in these countries is deep and significant and needs really, really great attention.
My name's Eun Lee. I'm from Impact Investment Exchange Asia. I like the earlier comment from Fujun about bringing 3 forms of capital across to underserved communities: social, human, and physical capital. I would add the need of investment capital. Dr. Roden, being such a key supporter for impact investing, could you share with us how you think impact investing could bring together the private sector and the public sector in addressing some of these challenges and growing inequalities in Asia?
Well, you know, there's trillions of dollars that is estimated in needs in terms of solving some of these problems, and only billions of dollars, if that, in traditional government aid and traditional philanthropy. And so there are many of us who believe that you're going to need private flows of capital and bring the capital markets into helping to solve social problems, particularly in the 21st century. The new field of impact investing is a field that is identifying double bottom line opportunities, opportunities for investing in social enterprise, opportunities for governments floating social impact bonds, opportunities for structuring layered financing so that new kinds of infrastructure, whether it's water or sanitation or housing, since in Asia in particular, urbanization is going to be, in addition to the other demographic shift, aging, really the thing that will pressure the societies in Asia most significantly. Except for China and maybe a few other countries, the opportunity to really invest in infrastructure in such a planful and intentional way is not there in many of these countries. What you see is unplanned urbanization with huge population shifts. Impact investing provides one opportunity to mobilize private sector resources into these growing, pressing social needs.
I was wondering whether much of the panel has focused on the inequality, short-term features, without necessarily linking it to what it portends or doesn't portend for long-term inequality. Now, let me put it in just 2 different senses of the term. One is the concern about the inequality in many parts of the world, as far as I can see, is not on the inequality per se, but the unfairness by which the rich have acquired their riches recently compared to the past. That more the fairness of the process rather than the outcome of inequality per se. For example, the financial crisis, the frauds, the misuse of the facilities that were available, regulations that were available, excessive use of loopholes, the whole host of things that led to the rich becoming richer is more of a concern than there are rich and there are super rich. And so this, it seems to me, focusing excessively on the inequality, which mixes up the fairness issue with other issues, something which ought to be discussed. Second thing is, by definition, globalization and the processes associated with it opened up opportunities that were not available before. And given that, it is very natural, since talents, abilities are naturally unequally distributed, some will get ahead faster than the others. So the notion that the inequality is increasing at the early stages of expansion of growth from globalization is natural once again. And that wouldn't be resented if it was primarily the talents and the abilities are the ones that led to the rich becoming richer in the globalization era. But that's not the observation, particularly since the financial crisis, and that is evident now because of the internet and all that. That was not, probably would not have been realized in the past. So in the long run, you don't want to kill off this responses to opportunities, creative destruction of Schumpeter and so on, in the excessive concern for the fraudulent element that led to inequality. And if it is fraudulent element, address that rather than talking about globalization as a whole. My last point is to thank Judy for pointing out the feminization of poverty that is taking place in this region across. And the one elephant that is missing in all Kishore's diagram is India. Where is India in that picture?
Okay.
Vivian Liu from Philanthropy Works. I actually have two questions. The first is, what is the role of values in leadership at various levels? How does that contribute or not, or mitigate the growing inequality that we're seeing today? My second question has to do with climate change and food insecurity. That would seem to be the major risk going forward, which, could roll back all the efforts we've made in poverty alleviation and reduction in the past decade or so. So what would be one or two major efforts going on right now, or that we could undertake in the next 5 years to mitigate this risk? Thank you.
Then I'm going to start with you, Nin, and go left to right.
I'd like to touch upon the question of the first question, the unfairness linked to inequality. That is what seems to matter most and to be causing the kind of widespread discontent.
Yeah.
Yes. And in Vietnam, it's a case in point. People don't say there shouldn't be inequality, but it's the kind of inequality, why it's there, and the kind of quickly accumulated wealth through corruption, graft, or through, not through, say, people wouldn't mind Bill Gates getting rich. But if you get rich overnight because you bought vast expanses of land for crumbs, and you wake up next morning and you're a near billionaire in US dollars, that doesn't earn respect, that earns resentment and anger rather. So I see that there's a point there that now it's the question of, at the end of the day, justice. There needs to be some justice in economic growth. We are back to basics.
Okay.
Great. Marx is back.
Okay, I just expand, actually, unfairness, your point as well. Unfairness, and link it to the point the lady just mentioned, values in leadership. I mean, it's about the lack of values in the process of enriching, in the process of government, and also the telescoping of the social economic capital. If people can control all of it, then they will use it almost inevitably unfairly into personal gain. So it's all about rebalancing that. And then when we come to look at scarce resources, if we want to portion those resources more fairly, we need to inject greater values and greater fairness in that process. So it comes back to values and injecting it. And then as a journalist, I would say transparency. We need more of us out there writing it about and getting it out so that we can expose those who are manipulating and conspiring, as Professor Fujian would say.
Gideon.
Well, I actually think it's not so much about values as about systems, because I think people all around the world are corruptible and susceptible to temptation and so on. But I think the one strength of the West, and I should mention it because we're pretty down on ourselves at the moment. But one strength is that although
we were quite kind to you, relatively speaking.
yeah, absolutely. But there was, you're right. There's a lot of anger about the fraud and so on that took place in the run-up to the financial crisis and so on. But I think in the US and Europe, there's still an expectation that if people are corrupt, if they break the law, they're quite likely to end up being disgraced or in prison. And so that, WorldCom, Enron, those people ended up in jail. There's an investigation into Goldman Sachs now. We don't know where it will lead, but there is an investigation. In my own country, there are MPs in prison, 4 or 5 of them, for really stealing quite small amounts of money by the standards of, Asian-style corruption. It was a few thousand pounds.
We do it in style.
And so I think that helps to, people still feel angry about inequality and about the system being rigged, but there's a sense that at least there is some recourse through law. And when I come to Asia, one of the things that unites very diverse countries is they're all going on about corruption. China, India, Indonesia. And it seems to me that's because there's a sense that not only is there inequality and corruption, but there's no recourse, that these people are getting away with it. And that's got to be corrected, I think.
Sure. Pujun?
Well, I think bits and bits of these questions can be connected with the value in leadership. One way to define leadership is you must have the ability to make a difference, not only to yourself, but also to the people around you. So there you see a strong social dimension. This is important because when if we are talking about the system, do you take the existing system as a given, or do you see there are rooms for further improvement? One way of the definition of leadership is I take the system as a given, but I grow myself, so I climb the ladder, then I become a political leader, and they say, oh, am I successful? But if you do not push the system forward, this to me is not good leadership. Leadership, you make a difference to yourself and also make a difference to the people all around you. And that logic applies to global leadership. If we face climate challenges, the international system now is nation-based. You make a difference to yourself, can you also make a difference for your neighbors? So this is leadership, and there is the place where you need to think internally about yourself. Do you have the value that cares not only about yourself and also about other human beings? And sort of to move the system forward, you must provide innovative, talented, and a principled leadership. Pragmatic oftentimes in Asian context is a good word, but to me, pragmatic without principle is very dangerous. Pragmatic, but with principles. And that is a way to define the value of leadership.
Anis?
Yeah, well, if you're talking about the long-term inequality at the global level, I think we need to address the architectural aspect of it, which is rather micro. But I would like to sort of tackle on the more on the micro side. Inequality matters now, say, compared to 40 years ago in some countries in Southeast Asia, because then everyone was poor. We were equal, but we're equal because everyone was basically poor. Now some were getting better off in a quite a fast period of time. Now the challenge, I think, in the long run, is to ensure that everyone sort of moving up the ladder, not only addressing the inequality, but ensuring that those who were left behind moving up. And I think the supplier of today's middle income group and today's top income groups, the supplier were higher educations. Access to education is key. We all here because we were educated. And everyone plays a role in the market, in the global world because of that aspect. And in this key, I think if we want to address in the long run, let's invest more on this, ensuring that they have the tools to play a role in the market, in the society, so that we can close the gap at the micro level, short term.
My colleagues have given very nuanced and wonderful answers to the first question, so I won't attempt that And I think I'll talk to you about the US afterwards, since this is a discussion about Asia in particular. But I want to take the question about climate change and food insecurity, because I do think that there's no way to think about the future of this region without really thinking about the impact of climate change and what that's going to do to food insecurity, water insecurity, and energy insecurity. So as these phenomena, already exacerbated by growing populations, by increased scarcity, by hoarding in many countries, so that, again, national policies are actually going to prevent the kind of regional sharing that may be necessary in order to tackle the scarcities and insecurities that will arise to climate change. We're going to need a whole different framework for not only what nations do about these issues, but what regions do to confront. Often one country's water problems are caused by another country's water behavior. And yet we're not seeing the kinds of understanding that says that climate change is going to magnify, exacerbate these many times over. And there needs to be a completely new framework for addressing that.
The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.